Hi folks, welcome back. Thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really does help when you do that. So welcome to episode 4 of Ditch to Fix. As you saw in the last episode, the drums are now all recorded. They are in Pro Tools, I'm looking at them right now, and they are sounding absolutely wonderful. Emily did such an incredible job, as always. It is always a delight working with Emily. And yeah, the drums, I'm blown away by them. They sound better than I could have ever imagined. So what I would typically do next is record the bass. I'd have the drums and the bass and then build all my guitars on top of that. But my mate Josh, who's going to play bass on this song, is actually really busy for the next few weeks. So I can't record bass with him until, about 3 weeks' time. So I'm going to crack on with the guitars and record all of those and add his bass at the end. And I'm going to have to second guess the low end content of my guitars a little bit, but I've worked with Josh so many times and I know what his bass sounds like and what I want the bass to be on this song. So it shouldn't be too much of a problem. So today what I want to talk about is I wanted to give you guys 12 of my tips for recording. I'm not going to get into detail about specific sounds and mic placements and all of that in this video, but just general tips for recording a piece of music. Number 1. Wear comfy clothes. Now I know that sounds a little bit trivial and daft, but bear with me. If you are sat wanting to get the best take out of yourself that you possibly can and really engage with your instrument, if you're wearing tight, uncomfortable jeans and you've got cold feet and your t-shirt has a label that's itching you, you're not going to be able to focus and it's going to take your attention away from what you're supposed to be doing. I'm filming all of this, so this doesn't really apply for me, but generally speaking, nobody's watching you as you record, especially if you're recording at home. And if you're in a studio, no one really cares. So wear comfy clothes, trust me, it really does help. Number 2, record more parts than you need. If you have an idea for a guitar part, record it. It is so much easier to have a really full session and then when you sit down to mix, go through and delete the things you're not actually going to be using, than to sit down to mix and wish you'd recorded that guitar part and have to go back, set everything up again, record it. It's so much easier to have it all there in front of you. So if you're umming and ahhing over whether you should double track a guitar part, double track it because you can then delete one of them later on. It is so much easier to chop things out of a recording than to go back and add to it over and over again. Number 3, sit in front of the amps. Now this is obviously a guitar recording thing as opposed to drums or whatever. But as you can see behind me, my 3 amps, if you can see that, are sat here. And I record usually all my guitars sat in this chair facing the amps, so with my back to the camera as it is. Now, a lot of people like to record with the amps in a separate room, and that's totally cool. They sit in the control room of a studio and their guitar is patched through to the live room and they just sit there in front of the monitors and the console and record their guitar parts. And that's fine, everybody does that pretty much. But for me, I like to have the amps really loud because that's generally where they sound their best, and I like to sit right in front of them. Be careful of your hearing, by the way. You really can damage your ears sitting in front of loud amplifiers, so make sure you look after that. But for me, having the direct connection and feedback between the sound coming out of the amp and the guitar, the sound from the amps vibrates the strings, it makes its feedback, it makes notes sustain longer than they usually would. I find that sitting in front of the amp really does make a guitar part more interactive to play, and it really makes you feel it a lot better. As I said, you can sit in the control room, that's absolutely fine, but for me, I really like to get up close and personal with the amps and have the sound from the amps really affect the overall sound of the guitar. Make decisions and don't fix in the mix, and this is very obviously going back to the title of this entire series. Now, one really big thing for that, for me, is record with effects. Now, we can record guitars completely dry. A lot of people just plug straight into their interface nowadays, but you can record a completely dry, clean guitar part and then apply distortion and delay and chorus and whatever you want in your DAW. But I find, and this is also because I like to kind of get back to basics as much as I can and use the old crackly analog ear, but you do play differently when you are playing through an effect. And if you are running through a chorus pedal going into your amps in real time, you will play to the sweep of that modulation. And of course, that's very specific to that particular take. It will never be the same twice. Whereas if you stick a plugin on a dry recording in Pro Tools, then you're not going to have that interaction of playing to the effect. It will just kind of sit over the top. And yes, it can sound great, and yes, you can tweak things later on, but it really does make a big difference playing to the effect. Same with delays. Yes, you can put it on, you can affect the feedback and the amount of delay time and whatever much easier in Pro Tools, but having the delay in line, coming out of your amps in real time, you play to that effect, you learn and adapt to play to it in a particular take, and it really, really does make a big difference. Know when to take a break. Now, this is something that we musicians, especially people who get really engrossed in studio recording, are not very good at. We like to get as much done in as short a period of time as possible. But believe me, it really does help to take a break. And all the time, I have situations where I'm trying to record a guitar solo and I just can't get it. And I get halfway through the take and I zone out and I forget what I'm doing and I have to start again. And it really winds us up, and the more frustrated we get, the worse we play, usually. And I've lost track of the amount of times that I've struggled so much with a guitar solo and eventually just abandoned it and thrown the guitar down. And I've come back the following morning and got it in 1 or 2 takes. It happens. Taking a break and knowing when to step away from a recording, and this goes for mixing and mastering and all of that as well. Knowing when to step away when you're not getting the best out of yourself, go and have a cup of tea. Go and stroke the dog, whatever you want to do. Step away and then come back, and generally it goes a lot better when you do that. Label your tracks. Now, this is very much a sort of producer, engineer's thing, but in Pro Tools, don't have 40 tracks called Audio 1 and Audio 2. You get lost very, very quickly. Make sure your tracks are labelled, and if you're anything like me, I like to keep track of what pedals I'm using and what guitars I'm using, so I always make little notes in the bottom of the tracks in the mix window of what I'm using, which guitar, which pickups, which effects pedals, and all of that. And it's also good to know for the future. If I look back at this recording in 10 years' time, I can see exactly what pedals I used and how they were set. So it's really handy to know that. But label your tracks, because otherwise you will get very lost very quickly. Set gain pedals back 1 notch and turn effects pedals up 1 notch. Now, this is a kind of a backwards philosophy, I suppose. But gain, when we add it to a guitar, we make it nice and crunchy and sound like a huge cranked amplifier and all of that. The more gain we put on, we have this perception that it will sound bigger and louder and fatter. And more often than not, that's not the case. And it's definitely true for recording. Yes, if you're playing live, you might want to turn the gain up a bit, make it a little bit easier to play, because the more gain, the more compression, the easier it is, and the more it kind of disguises any mistakes we make. But for recording, almost always guitars record better and sound nicer with less gain. So always use the least amount of gain that you can use for a particular guitar part. I'm not saying make it deliberately difficult for yourself and make it sound weedy when you want it to sound fat and like a slab of sound, but get your pedal or your amp or however you're doing it to a point where it's really working for you, and just knock it back a little bit, because that really does make a big difference. But the opposite is true for effects, modulation effects, time-based effects, reverbs, choruses, delays, flanges, phasers, all of those. If you have a depth knob on your delay or your chorus or whatever, set the pedal so it's working for you, and then just nudge that mix up a little bit. I almost always find that when I record a guitar with an effect on it, when it finally comes time to mix the song, I wish it was a little bit more pronounced and the effect was a little bit more obvious. Almost always it happens. So don't be afraid to really get your modulation pedal or your delay, whatever, really, really working with your guitar sound. Generally speaking, it works out for the best in the long run. Practice, practice, practice. And don't forget, practice. Now, this is something that kind of gets lost nowadays in the music industry, because we do edit everything so much all the time. And if you make a mistake, you just chop that bit out and put a good take in there. But doing this kind of not editing anything and starting at the beginning, hitting the red light and not stopping it until the song's finished, you want to get it right, and you don't want to be learning it as you're recording it, because it will just waste time. So, for example, in this song there's a clean picking section, and the first part of it's fairly easy to play, but the second half of it has some really weird chord shapes. It's something along the lines of this. Now that's a horrible chord. Sounds nice, but it's horrible to play. And if you want to get that guitar part sounding right from start to finish, you need to be able to hit that chord there without trying to find the fingering and miss notes. You have to be able to hit it first time. And there is no real way around that other than practicing. So I've been practicing that guitar part. I knew it was going to be in this song. I've been practicing it for months. So now hopefully I can sit down and I can play that guitar part right. Same goes for the lead, same goes for the rhythm. Make sure you know what you're doing and you can play it properly before you sit down to record. You can do it late night in front of the telly, sit on the sofa with your guitar and just practice that guitar part over and over again. But it really does make a difference when it actually comes time to track. Don't be scared by bright guitar sounds. Now, when we sit down, especially when we're sat in front of our amps, it's very instant gratification to have a big, weighty guitar sound that smacks you in the face. It's lovely to have that, and it records really nicely. I really like big, thick, weighty guitar sounds. But almost always when I sit down to mix electric guitars, I find myself in the mix adding high end and high mids. So don't be afraid of EQing your amps or your pedals to sound a bit brighter than you would usually use sitting in front of the amps. Because again, a bit like the modulations and the delays and things, having it a little bit brighter and a little bit more up front than your face does make a big difference when it comes to mix the song. It generally records better and sits in the track nicer. Don't forget that electric guitars are kind of the middle of your track when it's an instrumental guitar song. The drums and the bass are holding down the lows, and any acoustic guitars you might use and the cymbals are up top. So in the middle is where you live in those mid frequencies. Low mids for the rhythm, high mids and a bit of kind of sparkly treble for the leads. So don't be afraid to have your lead guitars quite bright, because you need to cut through the mix. And if you record a kind of normal, warm, thick guitar sound, you will generally find you have to EQ a lot of high mids in later on to get that guitar to sit properly in the mix. So don't be afraid to do that up front. Keep the energy of the first draft. Now this is, I believe it was an author that I heard talking about this, about how they did the first draft of their novel and they went through and edited it and edited it and edited it and then sent it off to their publisher and it came back. And then they went back and reread the first draft and it was so much more raw and exciting. So they actually went with the first draft. And this is really true for music as well, especially this so-called vintage style recording where we're trying to get performances out of ourselves. Now, when I was at university, we had a seminar with a chap, and I cannot remember the guy's name, but he played bass at times for Mike Oldfield, one of my heroes. And he played bass on Moonlight Shadow, so you can probably look up online what the chap's name was. Sadly, I can't remember it off the top of my head. But I remember him telling us in this seminar that when he went in to do the session for Moonlight Shadow, Mike Oldfield didn't want the band to sound too rehearsed. He wanted some character and some kind of energy there, and people not quite knowing exactly what it was, and people not getting too comfortable with the parts. So that's one thing that I always try and do when doing this start to finish no edit recording, is don't take too long on the guitar part. If it's not working, leave it, come back to it. If you can't get it in a few takes, leave it, you'll do a better job another day. But don't get too rehearsed with it. Don't play like a metronome. Have some character in it. If you are playing to a live drummer, as I am going to be on this song, don't listen to the drums so much that you learn every little, oh, she's pushing a little bit there or holding back a bit there. Play to the performance and perform yourself, because that will lead to a lot more character and energy in your recording. If it sounds too rehearsed, it will sound a bit flat. Choose gear that inspires you. Now, the next video in this series will be all about choosing what gear you want to use to record a piece of music or have in your studio. So I won't get too in-depth in this here, but if you are playing a piece of gear or a guitar that you're not comfortable with and you don't like the sound, you're not going to play very well. If you're playing a guitar you're very familiar with and the sound is really working for you and you're feeling it, then you will get, your playing will kind of go to another level and you'll get things out of yourself that you didn't know you had in you. Whereas if you're playing and you're not comfortable in the environment and it's not sounding right and it's a struggle to hit the notes in the way you want to play, it's not going to sound very good. So make sure you are completely dialed in with your own sound and you're feeling what you're doing before you start recording. And finally, set up your guitar. Now this does apply to any instrument really, but obviously for me it's guitar. Treat your guitar to some fresh strings. If your strings are getting a bit old and tired, the time to replace them is before you record, not after. You want your instruments to sound at their best. If your amplifiers have some slightly old power tubes in there and it's getting to the time where you want to start replacing them, do it before you record. Get everything sounding great. There is nothing more disappointing than hearing someone play an amazing guitar solo with an amazing sound, and then they start moving higher up the neck and the intonation starts going out and it starts going flat or sharp, sounds seasick. It's just a mess. So make sure your gear is working as it should before you record. Don't fix it. You guessed it, in the mix. So there we are, guys. Those are my 12 little tips for recording. I'm now going to start setting up my amps and my pedals behind me and start tracking guitars using all of those little ideas. So if you have any ideas of your own, please do share them in the comments underneath, and please do keep on asking Perky. You can write in with any of your questions and I will either reply to you in the comments or make a video answering your question in more detail if it's necessary, or both. And that's how I want this whole Ditch to Fix series to work. I want you guys to drive it. Ask me things, ask me about the things I'm doing, and I will absolutely make videos explaining them. So thank you for watching, guys. I hope that was helpful. As I said, in the next episode we're going to be talking about choosing the right gear to record a piece of music. And yeah, I hope that was interesting for you guys, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.